What if I told you that every single human alive today can trace their ancestry back to Black Africans? Not some of them, not most of them, every single one. The person sitting next to you, the stranger on the other side of the world, the people who look nothing like each other, all of them descended from the same dark-skinned people who lived on one continent hundreds of thousands of years ago. This is not a theory. This is not an opinion. This is what the science says. And once you understand it, you will never see the human race the same way again. Let us go back, way back. Further than Egypt, further than Greece, further than any empire or kingdom or civilization you have ever read about. We are going back 300,000 years to a continent called Africa, to a time when the entire human population of the earth could fit inside a single small valley. These people had dark skin, deep, rich, melanin-saturated skin. They had wide noses built for hot air. They had tightly coiled hair designed to protect their heads from a scorching sun. They were fully human, fully intelligent, fully emotional, and they were the beginning of everything. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer at the Natural History Museum in London has spent decades studying early human fossils. His research keeps arriving at the same conclusion. Modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa. The oldest confirmed human fossils ever found were discovered in Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, and they are 315,000 years old. These are your relatives, not symbolically, genetically, directly. And they were Black Africans living on a continent that the rest of the world would not even know existed for another 200,000 years. But why were they black? The answer is not complicated. It is actually elegant. The African sun is brutal. The UV radiation near the equator is among the most intense on Earth. Your skin needs protection from that radiation. Melanin is that protection. It is a biological shield. It absorbs UV rays before they can damage your DNA, before they can destroy folate in your bloodstream, before they can cause the kind of cellular damage that kills you young. Dark skin in Africa was not an accident. It was a survival tool. It was the reason your ancestors lived long enough to have children. It was the reason you exist. Geneticist Sarah Tishkoff at the University of Pennsylvania has studied African genetic diversity more deeply than almost anyone alive. What she found was remarkable. Africans are not just the oldest human population on Earth. They are the most genetically diverse. The genetic variation inside Africa is greater than the genetic variation between Africa and the rest of the entire world combined. Think about what that means. The rest of humanity is essentially a small branch, a subset, a narrow slice of the genetic tree that began in Africa and grew outward from there. So what happened next? For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors stayed on that continent. They spread across it. They adapted to different environments within Africa. Some moved to wetter forests. Some moved to drier savannas. Some moved to coastlines. But they stayed in Africa. And they stayed black because the sun was everywhere and the melanin was necessary and the biologies had no reason to change. Then, approximately 70,000 years ago, something shifted. Scientists call it the out of Africa migration. A small group of humans, maybe just a few thousand individuals, began moving. They walked northeast, out of Africa, through what is now the Middle East. They kept walking. They had no map. They had no plan. They were following food, following water, following instinct. But in doing so, they accidentally began the most consequential journey in the history of the species, because those few thousand people would eventually become every non-African human alive today. Geneticist Spencer Wells led the Genographic Project, one of the largest studies of human migration ever conducted. His team traced the DNA of hundreds of thousands of people across the globe and mapped the exact routes those early African migrants took, out of Africa through the Middle East. Some went north into Europe, some went east into Asia, some kept going until they reached the Americas, some crossed open ocean and reached Australia and the Pacific Islands. Everywhere they went, they carried African DNA with them. Your African DNA, because that is what they were, Africans, walking into a wider world. Now, here is where it gets extraordinary. As these people moved into new environments, something began to happen to their skin, and it did not happen quickly. It happened over thousands of years, slowly, quietly, through the invisible mechanism of natural selection. The further north these migrants went, the less intense the sunlight became. In northern Europe and Central Asia, in regions far from the equator, UV radiation dropped in dramatically. And here is the thing about melanin in low sunlight environments. It becomes a liability. Not because dark skin is bad, but because your body needs sunlight to produce vitamin D. And melanin, that same biological shield that protected your ancestors in Africa, now blocks too much of the weak northern sunlight from reaching your skin. In low UV environments, dark skin can lead to vitamin D deficiency, and vitamin D deficiency kills you. It weakens your bones. It disrupts your immune system. It causes fatal complications during childbirth. So the people with slightly less melanin survived better in northern environments. They had more vitamin D, they were healthier, they had more children, and those children passed on the gene for lighter skin, generation after generation, over tens of thousands of years. Skin gradually lightened in populations that had moved far from the equator, not because pale skin was superior, not because it was more evolved, but because it was a specific adaptation to a specific environment with specific light conditions. The gene most responsible for this change is called SLEC24A5. Researchers at Penn State University identified it as one of the primary switches controlling skin pigmentation in European populations. And here is what is critical to understand. This gene variant, the one that produces light skin, is estimated to have appeared in European populations only around 8,000 years ago. Some estimates put it at 6,000 years ago, which means for the vast majority of human history, even in Europe, humans were significantly darker than they are today. Pale skin is not ancient. Pale skin is recent. It is a blink in evolutionary time, and in Asia, a similar but distinct process occurred. Asian populations developed their own set of pigmentation adaptations, slightly different from European ones, because they traveled different routes, lived under different light conditions, and faced different evolutionary pressures. The result was a different shade, a different adaptation. But the origin was the same: African, dark, ancient. Meanwhile, back on the continent where it all began, nothing changed. The people who stayed in Africa kept their dark skin because they never left the environment that made dark skin necessary. The sun was still intense, the UV radiation was still high, the melanin was still essential, and so the people of sub-Saharan Africa today remain among the darkest skinned populations on Earth, not because they failed to evolve, but because they stayed in the environment where their original biology was perfectly suited. They are not behind. They are original. They are the baseline. They are what a human being looks like when biology is perfectly matched to the environment it was built for. The San people of southern Africa carry some of the oldest DNA lineages on Earth. Geneticists who study human ancestry call them one of the earliest branches of the human family tree. Their DNA contains genetic markers that predate the divergence of all other human populations. When you look at a San elder, you are looking at one of the closest living connections to the very first humans. And they are black. They have always been black. Their blackness is not a category. It is a timestamp. So let us bring this back to you, wherever you are in the world right now, whatever you look like, whatever your parents looked like, or their parents looked like. If you trace your ancestry back far enough, you arrive at the same place: a dark-skinned woman standing in Africa. Scientists sometimes call her mitochondrial Eve. She is not the first human being who ever lived, but she is the common maternal ancestor of every human alive today. Her mitochondrial DNA, passed down through mothers across hundreds of thousands of years, exists inside you right now. It exists inside every person on this planet. And she was black, and she was African, and she was the beginning of your story. Geneticist Rebecca Cann at the University of Hawaii co-authored the landmark 1987 study that first identified mitochondrial Eve. The study analyzed mitochondrial DNA from women across the globe and traced it back to a single common ancestor in Africa approximately 200,000 years ago. It shook the scientific world because it meant that every human being alive was not just broadly African in origin. They were specifically descended from one maternal lineage, one woman, one continent, one starting point. Race, as the world currently understands it, is at most 40,000 years old. Humanity is 300,000 years old, which means that for the vast majority of human existence, there was no such thing as race. There were just humans, dark-skinned, African, walking, adapting, surviving. The categories came later, the borders came later, the arguments about difference came much, much later. And by the time those arguments started, the science that would eventually dismantle them was already written into every cell of every human body on Earth. What if I told you that every single human alive today can trace their ancestry back to black Africans? You know the answer now. It is not a what if. It is a fact. It is the oldest fact about the human race. And it was written into your DNA long before anyone alive today was born to argue about it.